What I want to talk to you about this afternoon is really a cure for constipation I'm dealing with. And the constipation is about the past. And the constipation is that the culture that we live in seems to have a bit of a problem sort of moving things and adapting to things. And I want to start off, as the title of my lecture reveals, by looking at a recent phenomenon that is very typical of what our culture thinks about the past. About a year ago in the paper, and I'm talking front page of some papers, and I'm talking the news, the national news, two archaeologists, that's Darville and Geoffrey Wainwright, made a claim which was part of the publicity for the fact that they were taking garden spades to Salisbury A&E department, that a whole set of things had come together such that they were able to make this very important announcement about Stonehenge, that people were coming to Stonehenge to be healed, that it was in fact a healing centre. And I don't think any of you would have problems with that, especially those who came on the tour last night. There is something very special about sacred sites. In fact, the more time one spends at them, the more healthy generally you'll feel. But what was really interesting was the backdrop of this story. The story claimed that a dead Swiss horseman who was wealthy had ridden while very ill, and his body had been found, and it turned out that from dentology records of his teeth that he was a Swiss man, and he had been not cured because he was dead by these stones. And what happened then was that Geoffrey Wainwright, who was the English Heritage Director for a while, appeared on various programmes on television saying that, in fact, what had happened is that him and Timothy Darville had been all over for 7 years, all over the Preseli Mountains, and they had found that the Preseli bluestones, of which this is an example, which were brought to Stonehenge, we don't need to discuss how they got there, but they arrived at Stonehenge and they were used in Stonehenge, that these in fact had healing properties. Now I want you to read you a quote from Geoffrey. What I am suggesting has nothing ludicrous about it. These stones are connected with certain secret religious rites, and they have various properties that are medicinally important. Whenever people felt ill, baths were prepared at the foot of the stones, and they would pour water over them and run this water into baths in which their sick were cured. What is more, they mix the water with herbal concoctions. There is not a single stone at Stonehenge which does not have medicinal value. Did that sound rather like what you heard on telly? Yes. Well, it was actually, that is 873 years earlier, another Geoffrey of Monmouth said that. So now you might remember, if we go even further back, and I am starting to get a bit critical of these sorts of episodes because they block other things that are going on at monuments, that 10 years ago, you might remember, a stone was found with some script on it at Tintagel, the legendary conception and birthplace of King Arthur. Now this happened when Geoffrey, not of Monmouth, but Geoffrey Wainwright, was in fact the EH director at that time. And the local, or the archaeologist in charge of Cornwall, Britain's leading expert on Dark Age inscribed stones, wrote an article in this little Cornish magazine, Main Manvro, which I may recommend to you. And in it he says about this stone that was discovered, which he was completely removed from any comment on. Wainwright went to the press with it, and of course it was, again, headline news, it was on all the media, and he said, "We did not need the gift of prophecy to foresee the sort of shameless hype by English Heritage, the commercial agency that administers this duchy-owned ancient monument, that happened soon afterwards. First, some facts. The word Artugnu is not the Latin for Arthur, as quoted. It is not even Latin, but late British, ancestor of Cornish. Among 300 or so inscribed stones from post-Roman Wales and Cornwall, none bears any name remotely like Arthur in Latin or British. English Heritage sole function is to enhance visitor numbers and at Tintagel to sell the Arthurian goodies in their shop. Their press conference, that's English Heritage press conference on this stone being discovered, was hot on commerce and decidedly weak on fact and scholarship, and simply cheapened one of Cornwall's greatest sites. What is relevant is to grasp firmly that this discovery has absolutely no Arthurian meaning whatsoever, and that E.H.'s chief archaeologist should be ashamed of himself. Wow. So there was trouble at Mill with this, wasn't there? So we then have, after the story broke with the bluestones, going back to the bluestones, the most well-known local author in the area of bluestones is Dr. Brian John, who happens to have had in a past life a job as a doctor involved in geology. So he knows his stones, one would imagine. He also wrote to all the papers and appeared on all the television in Wales. Interestingly, I don't think he appeared anywhere else, saying that there was, in his folklore experience, he's a local expert on local folklore, that the bluestones' magical properties, i.e. they heal people, had no basis in fact. He couldn't find a single evidence other than sacred springs have healing properties, which our previous speaker more than covered, and which any of you who visit those will know that it's not singled out for this area of anywhere, and he could find no evidence connecting the bluestones with healing properties. So this was a media triumph for English heritage, and of course what it did do is it increased the profile of the monument we call Stonehenge, which is a lovely little milk cow for English heritage, and I'm very grateful it's open now. But it doesn't answer that final point there, the mysteries of Stonehenge being solved, because they haven't been. What has happened is that we've put like a blur of fuzziness between us and the monument. And what I would like to do next is to look at the questions that I have been asked by many media companies and other people who've interviewed me in the 20 years I've been doing this, to define what are the questions that people need to have answered about Stonehenge. So we look first at the questions that we ask about this monument in order to try and get rid of this fuzziness and start to put something together that makes more sense. I like sense. I presume that you've come to this lecture because you do too. No one said no. We'll move on. Who built it? Well, archaeology has done a brilliant job of telling us a little bit about the Wessex culture, and it's not done any job at all about telling us other things about the culture, but we have their dental records, we know how people died, we know the age at which they died, and that is the job of archaeologists. It's basically still to take things out of the earth and start to, through various very, very powerful scientific methods, such as radiocarbon dating, drilling into bones, finding out dental records, finding out what people died of, and it's a whole science. There's one very big expert at our local university called Ros, who really took me through the process. It's remarkable. It's like a police forensic. And in fact, indeed, some of her work is when a corpse is found, or a skeleton is found, to identify that it died well before the police would have any interest in it. So there's who built it has been answered to some extent. We know quite a lot, although it's only in my lifetime that we know quite a lot about when many of these monuments were built. This morning you heard how these boundaries have been pushed back and back and back and back. When I was a lad, which is, as you implies, quite a long time ago, Stonehenge was blessed with the research of Professor Richard Atkinson, an archaeologist of the old school, very high-profile archaeologist who wrote probably still one of the best books, single books on the subject of the monument, just called Stonehenge. Great title. Now, Atkinson had three phases of Stonehenge. Basically, it began around 2000 BC and finished at 1400. Now we've pushed that earlier date back at least 1,000 years, and the 1400 remains more or less when things were abandoned at Stonehenge. So archaeology has done quite a good job, and radiocarbon dating was an amazing explosion for people who were involved in archaeology, leading to Stuart Piggott saying that the scientist data, radiocarbon data, was archaeologically unacceptable. And there was a battle, and everyone had to revise their theories on Bronze Age and Neolithic life. Now, we don't need to go into that, but those two questions, who built it, when was it built, have been addressed fairly and squarely, and much progress has been made. Why was it built? We enter into a very, very different arena. And this lecture is about why that question hasn't been answered, really. Why Stonehenge was built is about more than just the monument itself. It's about the aspirations of the people, the culture or cultures that wanted to drag these enormous big sarsen stones 17 miles as the crow flies from Marlborough Downs, Fifield Down, and the bluestones, of which are the diminutive bluestones, but nevertheless up to 4.5 tons, 135 miles as the crow flies from West Wales. Now, even if we accept that they did that for some, because they needed nice stone, there must, one feels, be some reason why you would want to carry stones that distance, and we must look at that. Now, the archaeologists haven't really addressed that, and in fact, my dearly departed friend John Michel, in his book of the name of this conference, says that the end product of all these labours of all these archaeologists hasn't answered the primary question of why there are so many of them and why they were built in the first place. I might be misquoting that a little, but it's more or less what he said. The next question is even more interesting, because we need to know, why was it built where it is? Because one assumes, and if you've been to Stonehenge, and especially if you've been where these ladies are, if you've been to Stonehenge, you can't imagine that this site was ever built without a plan. And we can't ever imagine how it, or why it was built where it is, without somebody giving that some thought. Just as we have planners today, you wouldn't stick a stone circle in a position that wasn't, should we say, propitious for the area or the situation. And these sites, and all stone circles, are normally so beautifully attended to in terms of the fine detail of where they're situated, that actually it is possible to go to some sites and find yourself totally enchanted by the cleverness of the ability to find just the perfect spot. Now, Alexander Thom, of which you know I'm quite fond, or was quite fond of his work, even waxes more lyrical about that aspect of stone circles in his books than anything other, when he describes how engineers, because his word for the boys was a Victorian, they didn't have the girls in Victorian time doing engineering, but the boys went out and they found a level site in the middle of the Lake District, and they built a stone circle that is absolutely perfect in terms of its astronomy, its geometry, the way it mirrors the mountain tops, and without doubt, Tom was in awe of that site, and so should everybody else be. But when you go to the site, there's a little plaque saying, might have been built around 1700 BC. We don't know much about it, but don't leave any litter. Bye. So why was it built where it is? Now, the media really are onto this one, or were a few years ago. But there is one other question that has to be answered about Stonehenge, and it takes us right back to Geoffrey Wainwright and Timothy Darville. And it's this: why were the bluestones so important? For the reasons I've mentioned, you don't drag stones 135 miles when you haven't got a reason. It's not a wet Sunday afternoon activity. And so the bluestones are a very essential part of Stonehenge. They were there right at the beginning, around 3000 BC. At some stage, they built a monument that had trilithons out of bluestones. There are some bluestones on the ground that you can inspect that have mortise and tenon joints, rather like on the top of that stone there, and they are still visible on site. Atkinson, when he did his excavation, left one on its side visible rather than return it to its position so that you could see that hole in the bluestone. There are also tongue and groove bluestones. So if I'm going to just flip through and look at this incredible monument, we've done that one, we'll just flip through. Some of these were taken on the tour last night, recently, not last night, last year, but megalithomania, there we are, look at that. Now, there we are, there's an interesting view of the tallest stone on the site, and that doesn't look like any of the others, but there it is, standing alongside a chunky one that has fallen and broken in two. And wherever you go in Stonehenge, you will find bluestones mixed with sarsen stones. Henry James said, if ever you want to discover the meaning of life, it is well to consider the enormous, stand here and consider the enormous backdrop of time. There's the axis from the front. Some rather doctored photos, people. Now, if you're proposing making changes to the way we answer those questions, it would be arrogant of me to say that someone hasn't already put down a protocol for that, and it's an archaeologist. Dr. Ewan Mackay, who was once the curator of the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow and a senior lecturer in archaeology, in 1979 made a little film for the university for his undergraduates. I was blessed that he lent me a copy, and I actually transcribed what he said on that. And it is a charter for what I propose for the missing components of megalithic study, the archaeologists' missing components. He said, Professor Tom's controversial views that maintain that a highly skilled work in surveying, in geometry and in observational astronomy had been developed and were being carried out in Britain and in Brittany by about 1800 BC, and that the standing stones are mute evidence of this. If correct, the importance of these theories is great for several reasons. First, because they completely alter our picture of prehistoric British society, what it was like and what it was capable of. Secondly, they are important because the archaeological profession never came anywhere near trying out Tom's methods, let alone reaching his conclusions. His work opened up a new and almost completely unsuspected window onto the past, which the profession was evidently not equipped to detect. Archaeology prides itself on its multidisciplinary approach, but it would seem to follow, therefore, that there must be a gap in its training and methodology which ought to be filled. Now that is 1971, and it's almost a charter. It was a very prophetic statement about what was wrong with conventional archaeology, how it was missing the point. And so, if we're going to look at the missing components of the megalithic culture in contemporary archaeology, we have to follow through with what Ewan Mackay say and look at what is missing and what needs to be included in archaeologist training. Because the way things are going, archaeologists will shortly find themselves completely bypassed from some of the most exciting developments that have happened. And that would be rather sad because they have a valuable role to play. Let's look at astronomy first of all. Edrych ar y gorwel means look to the horizon, which is a good Welsh phrase. It means keep out of trouble, really, which is something I've never been able to do very well. There are several problems. There are symbolic alignments where you can say this stone here and that stone there. When you look here, it's roughly aligned on the summer solstice or the winter solstice or the major moonrise. That's not the same thing as a precision alignment. A precision alignment is when you can say that there is a very, very high accuracy between where you're standing, the monument that's marking where you stand, and the foresight, as it's known, like a rifle barrel. And archaeologists have been quite, I think we could say, they've been fluffy-mouthed about the way they distinguish between these two. And we'll see later some of this obfuscation creeping into press statements and popular statements about the difference between these. The problem of the Earth's axial tilt with time means that most people can't go to sites today and watch the sun setting over the alignment because there has been a slight shift in the Earth's tilt. And you need to do some maths, some sums, or a computer program to reconnect where the sun would have set. Now, that's not a big deal. It often involves only walking about a few tens of feet, at most half a mile, north or south of the point that was an alignment, making that correction, which you can calculate if you know how. If we still had the Earth's axial tilt the same, we would have absolutely no problem, and these sites would undoubtedly be recognised for what they are. Some of them are very much more precise and very much equally symbolic. They can be both. And you would be able to go, and there would probably still be rituals connected with them at the salient times of the year. The problem of archaeological safety is well known in every profession, that a subject only changes when the people who wrote the present PhDs retire. And I think that's a universal problem of human beings. And the greatest changes that occur are usually when a youngster comes along and gets rebuked. I mean, it's a classic myth, isn't it? The young blade comes in, old king, new king. Yeah, that's happens in every profession. My background was in electronic engineering, and knives were out every 6 months rather than every retirement, because it was a subject moving so fast that nobody could keep up with it. The reason I'm using one of these and we've got one of those is the consequence of that. And this, gosh, and that, and that, and that. I'll harp. No, that's all right. The next component that's missing. Now, of course, Alexander Thom has been written out of the textbooks for university graduates. The man who did all the work on this has been completely blitzed out. The second thing is metrology. Alexander Thom began his quest by doing something engineers love to do. He said, I wonder if they were using rulers, or what was the length they were using. Let's go and have a look. And for 40 years later, he came up with the fact that a unit he called the megalithic yard. He found it by statistical analysis, which he asked expert statisticians to go over at 400 sites, and it's completely ignored today. In fact, mention it, and you are, without doubt, suddenly you find a bucket of cold somethings pouring on you from a great height, and you will not get promoted, which is, I think, what we could safely say that Dr. Ewan Mackay wasn't Professor Ewan Mackay, because he stood up for the work that Alexander Thom was doing. Richard Atkinson was a professor already, but he stuck up for Thom towards the end of his time at Cardiff. The third thing is geometry. Stone circles have form, which basically means that they have an organic dimension, an organic shape, and they have set dimensions, which are measurable, objective, scientific, dim problem, oh gubble, as they say in Wales, no problem at all. You can go there with a tape measure or a laser ranger, as we did to Stonehenge last night, and all these prime measurements that appear incorrectly in books can be put right at a stroke. The identifiable units of length come out of that because you find that they are quantized in small positive numbers of these units of length. And why are they located where they are? Well, we'll come on to that later. But these are the three basic things that are missing. And now, what are these three basic things? You've seen them before if you've ever studied educational theory. Geometry, astronomy, metrology. And let's look at it in a bit more detail. Here's some Neolithic balls. Are landscape alignments, polygons separating, is this a load of Neolithic balls or something else? This is a famous picture taken by a wonderful photographer, Graham Challifor, and in a lot of Keith Critchlow's talks, and I've got permission to use them. But here we have, in no doubt Neolithic times, there's no question of that, they've been dated and everything. There are over 600 of these in Edinburgh Museum and Glasgow museums, and some years 3 or 4 are ploughed up, and some people have got them on their mantelpiece in Scotland. Farmers have got them on their mantelpiece. Every one of the platonic solids in 3 dimensions is represented by these shapes. Now, if you don't know what a platonic solid is, or you think it's something you feed to babies when they're 10 weeks old, I would suggest that you start very seriously looking at what this means. This means that they were fluent in 3-dimensional geometry, not the sort of stuff that that stone circles are. And therefore, we just look at this geometry bit. There's an egg. It looks like a bad circle made on a Friday, Poet's Day, and there's how it's made with a 3, 4, 5 right-angled triangle, and you go to each of the points and you can create the different curves that make it up. There are 30 of those in Britain, and at least the same number in Ireland, and they're found in Brittany, with the same triangle. We can look at this shape, which again looks like somebody's run out of stone, or they've got trouble measuring a circle, and that has an exquisite geometry that involves the vesica piscis, which I may remind you is a very big symbol here. Division of a circle into 3, vesica piscis, and there are at least 25 of these in the northern half of the British Isles. There's one, quite a few in Cornwall. There's an ellipse with a loop of rope round it. You move the top point around it, just traces out the shape. You have 2 foci, 2 focuses, a focus is a hearth or a fireplace. It's the same word in Latin. So you can trace out an ellipse. There's loads of ellipses in Britain with different right-angled triangles. Now, if you look at what's going on there, right-angled triangles that are Pythagorean, the whole number, there are many of them, but the two lowest ones are 3, 4, 5. The first in the series is 3, 4, 5. The second is 5, 12, 13. This is second year in high school stuff. This is not rocket science I'm talking about. Astronomy, geometry, mathematics and metrology, they're all part of what is known as the quadrivium of the traditional arts. Something that Keith Critchlow's been banging on about for years and years and years, and done great work in re-energising the fact that you're not educated unless you've had the traditional arts, the quadrivium joins with the trivium, which is what I'm doing now, rhetoric, grammar and poetry. And unless you have all 7 as the heptad, you're not really able to be a bard or an educated person or a priest. And so this was the educational requirement of a civilized society, and has been for at least since the Greeks defined their terms. There's a nice photograph. There's a megalith with a hole in it. It's a dolmen with three uprights. There's one of them. There's the other one. And the third one is making 2 little triangles. The sun's coming through at midsummer. Now, I love this site. It's my local megalith. It's about 5 miles from my back door. And at midsummer, I discovered years ago, its axis of symmetry is aligned to the midsummer sunset. Some years later, I discovered one very, very clear day that not only does the sun align to the monument align to sunset, but the sun sets into Lugnaquilla Mountain in Ireland, something we heard about in Robin Williamson's amazing creation, with the name Lugh or Lud is a Celtic god, and there we have the arrows of Lugh in Ireland, 93 miles distance, and that's on the web if any of you want to check. The PDF's freely available, no charge. Just go on and you'll find all sorts of things going on about this monument. Now that's an example of astronomy. You can't get more precise than a thing that shows the setting sun. A rifle barrel 93 miles long is going to be an incredibly accurate precision alignment. I mean, the sun wobbles a bit when it sets, but it doesn't. Nothing we can do about background noise, but it doesn't wobble that much, and this site's accurate to 3 minutes of degree. Now, with that in mind, and what you've just seen with that earlier photograph, the sun sets through that triangle. The sea horizon is here. Many of you will have seen this picture before. The sea horizon is actually there. That golden glow is the sea. So it's pitched just perfectly so that in the chamber it lights up first in one triangle as it begins to set, and it lights up the other triangle as it concludes its setting. And now we get what has been, in a popular book, the obfuscation. There is no evidence of the use of astronomical observations for practical purposes, such as the determination of the time of year. The idea that distant horizon features, such as notches, could be used to pinpoint the motions of the sun or moon to a few minutes of arc have now been discounted. Okay, and that's from a professor of the only professor we've ever had in archaeoastronomy, in a book called Astronomy Before the Telescope. And what that does, it tells normal people who are not specialists that they're wasting their time because actually it's silly. Now it is subtle, but it is giving that message off, and it is a failure to engage with the evidence that's causing that statement to be made, or it is tampering with the evidence, in which case that's something else, or it is ignoring the evidence, which is very human, but that's something else again. So let's look at another site that starts to bring what I'm talking about, the holistic megalithic culture and its arts together. Here's Bryn Celli Ddu, blocked by my theodolite. On a lovely day, there's a stone there, one of 5, where there was an ox burial, and I was asked by the Professor Steve Barrow at Cardiff University because he can't do it, because they don't do it anymore, to measure the passage angle. And the last person to do that was Sir Norman Lockyer, the Astronomer Royal, in 1904, I think. So I went there one lovely Easter, and it's a beautiful site. Now I want to draw your attention to some features of this site. I hope you can still all hear me. I want you to draw, this is looking from the chamber, and there's the theodolite, and although you can't perhaps see it as well, you will see something that looks like a triangle there. Can you see that? Right, well that's actually, and so often does this happen when modern people build houses near sacred sites. that the horizon's clear, but they build the house on the barn or the cowshed exactly on the alignment. Except this time it's not quite high enough, and the backdrop of the slope behind this thing is there, behind the house is there, and the angle of that, as we'll see later, is aligned to the passage angle up there. It is also coincidental with the solar midsummer sunrise. So we've got a site that has a passage angle. That's its back passage. There's its latitude. And there's the front passage of the monument. And we've got the passage aligned to the midsummer sunrise. The latitude of the site equals the passage angle. And then we've got to face something that might send shiver down your back. That the passage is aligned to the midsummer sunrise, and the angle of the passage is also equal to the latitude of the site, which is 53 degrees and 12 minutes. Finally, so we've got this site is doing many, many interesting things. It's almost saying 53 degrees 12 minutes if you can measure latitude. If you can measure the sunrise angle, it's saying the same angle. And finally, if you want to combine the three, it's saying somebody here wants to give us a little bit of a message about angles and how clever we are. Because verily, this is very clever stuff. Now, it's connected to other important megalithic sites, and we'll be looking at that later. Stonehenge. We find in the middle of Stonehenge, right early in the beginning, 4 sarsen stones, probably laid about 2,700, arranged in a 5-12 rectangle. A rectangle that makes a 5-12-13 triangle with the diagonals, or 2 of them, with their hypotenuses clamped together. Now, how anybody can look at Stonehenge as the charter for its development recently did and have 300 pages about how to build road tunnels and how to improve the toilets, and then have one paragraph that's saying that any geometry or astronomy at Stonehenge will remain purely speculative, in one sentence, again, is another put down for anybody looking for it. A big, thick document done by experts. And so when we see, there we are, we'll go back to that later. It's a fun slide, that one. 56 holes, absolutely the minimum number of holes you need or markers you need in a circle to make a sun-moon calendar that predicts eclipses. End of story, no problem. Been doing it with 10-year-old kids for years, and some adults. 30 uprights in the sarsen circle, one of them's half width, it looks like it might be a moon sign. There's also, wherever you look at Stonehenge, the geometry and the astronomy seem to be doing a dance together. And if you want to investigate that, there are plenty of books that enable you to do it, from John Michel onwards. So we reach a point where there's some evidence. I've found some evidence. Several people in this room I've been speaking to, such as Howard Crowhurst, who you can hear tomorrow at 12 o'clock, have found masses of evidence that are just the same, and they've found it in Brittany, which is Gran Britannia, which is Great Britain. That's funny, isn't it? So these are the things that you meet when you're doing what I'm doing. It's a fluke, a one-off coincidence. In other words, you've been wasting your time because what's happened is it just happens that the passage angle and the midsummer sunrise and the latitude happen to be the same. I mean, you know, it could happen, couldn't it? No. Your sums are wrong. I get that occasionally. That infuriates me because I used to teach maths. And to 16 to 19-year-old lads at colleges, and also A-level to people in their first year at university. You're not an archaeologist. Well, I'm not an archaeologist. I would have loved to have done an archaeology degree, but it doesn't lead to gainful employment anymore. If you do an archaeology degree, you've got a problem finding an honest, regular job. This kind of stuff has been discounted, which an example of which I gave you earlier about that site, symbolic and precision alignments. I do not believe your hypothesis is what the editor wrote on what Tom's first paper to Antiquity. He wrote it in great big red ink. I do not believe your hypothesis, and returned his script, which was an amazingly rude thing to do. And finally, your loony fringe is the final one. It's when you can't think of anything else. And I'm officially a member now. Now, here's a site talking about it's a one-off coincidence. This is a blurred site, which I stole off Howard's website, of a place where I spent the summer solstice 2 years ago. Absolutely amazing site. This is a site in Cricúno, just near the delightful town of Plúharnal, which is near Carnac in Brittany. And we went there at something like 3:30 in the morning, about 40 people with various things, and went there and stood here, and we watched the sun rise right on that stone there. And whether you call that symbolic or accurate, there are some very fascinating properties about this site. The first thing is that the 4 diagonals record from each corner the various key midwinter and midsummer sunrises and sets. So that's very interesting. The second thing is that it's made up of, I think we've got now, it's based on 2, 3, 4, 5 triangles. So if you connect any of the diagonals, you end up with a 3. This is the 3 side, that's the 4 side, that's the 5 across the middle. So it's based on 2, 3, 4, 5 whole number triangles. The diagonals of the 3, 4, 5 rectangle indicate both solstice sunrises and sunsets, but they only do it at the latitude of Cricúno, near Plúharnal, Brittany. So in other words, my 53 degrees 10 minutes in Anglesey is the same angle as a 3, 4, 5 triangle, or one of the angles of a 3, 4, 5 triangle, the other one being 36.8 degrees. And here we have another site, a square stone circle, that actually uses the latitude of the site, because this only occurs at this latitude, that the actual sunrise occurs on the diagonals of a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Now, I do want to make another point we often miss because we're so used to looking at maps where the north does that and the east-west does that all these sites that we've been showing are aligned to the cardinal points. And you might ask yourself how primitive culture defines north and south and east and west as accurately as evidently they do. Discuss. If any of you find out any answers, I'd be very happy to hear from you. Here's King Arthur's Hall on Bodmin Moor. We saw Dosemary Pool in the last lecture, and here, if you go well up, excuse me, in altitude, King Arthur's Hall, an anomalous site, because it's a 512 rectangle. That wasn't known until 3 weeks ago, when I went with, I did find it out, but I went up to confirm it. You can get some idea of its rectangular shape, because it is actually a pond in the middle, usually, but we've had a dry spring, and there it is. It's a bank surrounded by stones. And I've drawn the stones in a pictorial way because there's a lot of damage now and half of them are missing or fallen. But it's a rectangular site, 5 by 12, aligned to the cardinal points nearly, not quite. And there are stacks of examples of 5, 12 and 13. And Howard Crowhurst has now he's firmly got his theodolite between his legs. He's beginning to firmly establish what were then suspicions about angles, and he's narrowing them down to seconds of a degree in the geometry and the astronomy of sites in Carnac. So we've got firm geometry, firm units in megalithic yards coming out of this, and in other units, which are related, but that's another story which would take too long here tonight. So we're getting to the idea that the astronomy and the geometry and the metrology might actually be connected. And if that's the case, we have got then some sort of holistic view of this culture. So we go back to Lecadribeth, and we see some anomalous lens flare and whatever you would like to call it, depends on whether you're a scientist or Diana Cooper. And there's another site just down the road from Lecadribeth. You won't find this in any of the archaeological textbooks, even the more popular ones, that the site nearest to it, that's a dolmen rather than a chambered tomb, is just down the road from it, and it also is aligned to the midsummer sunset. Neither site does one say that, but the axis of symmetry of this is aligned to midsummer sunset on the sea. Can't see the mountain because it's at sea level, this blighter, but you see that little chink there, that's where they've carved the capstone in order for that to fit. Can you see that? Can you see it? Then that little chink there allows the sun through at the sunset at the date of the monument, given to me by an archaeologist friend at Lampeter University. I won't cover the lunar standstill, that's for really something else. And then we look at the biggest monster, Pentrefan we've got, the most delightful horn-chambered tomb in Wales. Huge mound over it, and there it is, look, a usual view from looking at it northwards. And we find that from Pentrefan to Lecadribeth is in fact very nearly north-south. And I've got more to say about that in about a year when I've developed what that's all about. But Lecadribeth and Pentrefan are talking to each other because they're aligned on the cardinal points. The magic mountain, Carningli, the symbolic mountain next to it, is west. The peak of it is west. So we've got north, south, east and west. Pentrefan does it best. I think that's quite a good little chant we could apply to the monument. Now, none of this is in any of the books. Why isn't it? Has no one been there with a theodolite and noticed this? It stands out like anything, because you get a theodolite lined up on Lecadribeth, and if you've done the reading, you'll find that it's within 1 degree of north and south. And there we've got a geometric connection, which brings us full circle back to Darville and Wainwright, that in fact, once you start looking at the geometry, it's fairly obvious that Stonehenge, Lundy and the Bluestone site form a 5, 12, 13 triangle. I've been flogging this to death for years, and I apologise for those of you who are worn out with it. It's a bit like, you know, if you're a pianist and everyone asks you to play one tune, you know, all the time. But the fact is, it's still a highly potent example of a connection between Stonehenge and the Bluestone site, because uniquely this triangle happens to be able to allow you to forecast eclipses and calibrate the calendar and balance the sun and the moon, the male and the female, and all that brouhaha. And it's also calibrated very accurately if you do the sums in megalithic yards, such that if you use 2 megalithic yards, you actually get the 12, 13, 5 at the beginning of the huge numbers. Now that might seem very silly. It might even seem nonsense. But Arthur C. Clarke said, any technology you don't understand, you tend to think is either nonsense or magic. And he was possibly the top science fiction visionary of the last generation. We could argue that over a pint and discuss various other sci-fi authors like John Wyndham or Nigel Neal or Azimuth or Heinlein or whatever. But the point is, here we have a 5, 12, 13. No, actually, tomorrow, there's a little film showing the discovery of that point on Lundy as the beginning of nailing that one with John Michel, who fought with me for years about whether this was a reality or whether it was in my head. So if you come tomorrow afternoon, you will see that. Now, most of you will have seen that before. So it's rather astonishing that Rollo sends me a brochure from the Royal Astronomical Society. I have it here. Please excuse me while I find it. Here we are. There's all sorts of things in here. For a start, they draw for the first time, they're starting to draw pictures that look remarkably like Sun, Moon and Earth, my little wooden book. In fact, I think they may have nicked them, but I don't want to make an allegation. They possibly could have been influenced by them. But they actually draw, and I'll try and make it so that you can see them, they actually draw and acknowledge for the first time the major moonrise along the long side of that triangle. See if we can get that back for you. The major moon, if they sort of Stonehenge, which it isn't, Stonehenge is there, but the angle at Stonehenge of the 5, 12, 13, one direction, the long direction, points to the major moonrise. The car park post holes mark that, the big white blobs in the car park. And then the other short sides, of course, parallel to the axis, which marks the midsummer sunrise, which William Stukeley discovered in 17 blah. So this brochure's got that in, but it doesn't got the rectangle, but it doesn't mention its 512 geometry or any other mention of geometry. But it is a start. And it poses an interesting question, because I'll read you the bit. It says that Stonehenge could only be placed, if Stonehenge was placed at the latitude where you get a square for the sunrise and the moonrise at extreme, it would have to have been built in the English Channel. Now this is another obfuscating one that relies on you not knowing how we arrive at where the moon and the sun rise, because the calculation that places that rectangle and the latitude in the channel, in the English Channel, does not account for refraction and other little little tweaks you have to do. Stonehenge is placed where it is, and Alexander Thom, in his survey, showed that they were at right angles to each other, unequivocally published in the Journal of the History of Astronomy, which is a peer-reviewed professional magazine. So there's no doubt that the rectangle is aligned both to the midsummer sunrise and the extreme moonrise in the north, and that is a right angle. It can't be questioned anymore because the work's been done. It could still be done again. Of the 56 Aubrey holes in eclipse prediction, it says this can only predict eclipse danger periods, a very different thing from predicting actual eclipses, for which the device would be unreliable. What? It could only predict eclipse danger periods? Funny that in my wooden book it says eclipse danger periods with a little shaded bit, and then it says, however, and they haven't obviously read the however. The device doesn't predict whether an eclipse will be visible, but it predicts full moons, new moons, and even quarter moons. And it can predict eclipses and tell you which moon and which sun might be eclipsed. In other words, it won't tell you the ones that won't be eclipsed. It'll tell you the ones that are eclipsed, but you might not be able to see the eclipse because you're living on the wrong side of the earth or you're in the wrong place for another reason. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So this is another obfuscation. The device would be unreliable. Now, for years, I've loved teaching young kids how to use this Aubrey device in order to predict where tides, moons, where the eclipses are going to occur and when they're going to occur. And this is not a true statement, and it's in the brochure. Now, I don't want to criticise what I think is actually quite a good brochure, because it also tends to under-egg everything. Institutions are conservative. Let's look at this one. Same design, same latitude. These are both primary sites. In other words, everyone's heard of them. We've got Bryn Celyn Ddu on Anglesey, and that's an artist impression of what it was like before they built the later chamber. It's a German sausage with stones in it and very intelligent people. And then we've got Arborough in Derbyshire, which are almost a completely similar sort of structure there. And if we look at them, the two of them, they're within 2 minutes of the same latitude. That's very, very close over the distance they are, because one of them's 120 miles from the other one. Now, what does that mean? We can't connect those sites, can we? Well, they're obviously east-west of each other. And then we've got another site further west of Bryn Celyn Ddu. It's 11 miles west, that's within 3 seconds of a degree. That's 175 feet it is, off being exactly east-west of Bryn Celyn Ddu. Now, we don't know how that's done, but the fact is I can connect them because they look the same. They look very, very similar. And if we go on, we can see that they form, with Stonehenge, a rectangle with a fourth point. But even without the rectangle, we get a triangle. And if you go on Google Earth, it doesn't really matter which system you use. Google Earth will give you exactly the gist of what I'm going to say now. Then these 3 prime sites, everyone's heard of that one. It's probably one of the most important sites on Anglesey for many people. Arborough is the Stonehenge of the north, and Stonehenge is the Arborough of the south. So we've got 3 sites connected in a triangle, and you can measure the mileage with Google Earth, or you can do it the long way, and I rather like that because I'm a maths geek. And when you do that, you get a 345. So we've got 3 sites, prime sites, unequivocally connected through a 345 arrangement. And Snowdon is here, so it runs right through the peak of Snowdon, which is interesting. But I am saying that there's some sort of landscape connection going on between sites which has been previously ignored, or shall we say, it hasn't been made available. When we look at the units, we find a unit that John Michel proposed ages ago, 24 over 7 miles. It's related to all the Egyptian units and the Greek units, and we have no problem with that. 40, 50, 30 of those units. So it's a 345 triangle. And its accuracy is better than 1 part in 200, 99.5%. Now, for primitive savages marking north, south and east and west and knowing about a 345 doesn't fit anymore. the problem is that once you accept that this is a reality and not drummed up by some sort of foolish old maths teacher, you are going to very quickly have to everybody will need to revise their view about the capability, which is where we started with you and Mackay, the capability of this culture. We can put the other triangle on there and we find the units are very similar. If you keep the 30, 40, 50 here, you've got 36, 39 and 1.5, which is 12, 5, 13. So even in the units of this triangle, we get uniformity. So one's the first Pythagorean triangle, 2 degrees north of Stonehenge is our below, and then we go across to Bryn Celyn to define that. This baseline here to Lundy is the 12 side of a 5, 12, 13, and we've got the second Pythagorean triangle. Now, I want you to notice the angle here is 53.13 degrees. So we return to Bryn Celyn, a site with good latitude, and we find that we get a confluence, to use Glenn's term for rivers, a confluence of the same thing going on to a remarkable accuracy, where we get the latitude of the site is 53, 12, 26, the angle of the passage is 53.04, 55, or nearly 53.05, the sunrise angle is 53.04, and the angle of the 345 to Stonehenge is 53.07. And then a remarkable statement handed out to students at Leicester University. In the course, the BA in Archaeoastronomy, we do not consider the work of Alexander Thom, partly because the subject is a very technical one, and partly because many of the issues are no longer of archaeological interest. Now, something's going on for that to appear in a syllabus. How can the father of archaeoastronomy, which Thom is acknowledged of being, and all his obituaries say that, a bit like John Michel is the father of modern earth mysteries, you just wouldn't doubt that. But how is it possible for somebody, what is going on for somebody to write that in a handout to students? Did you find that everything I've discussed is rather too technical? Do you think it has no archaeological interest? Even if I'm just right a bit, it's got amazing archaeological implications. And so let's look at this. Let's start talking about continuity. If we take the 5 side of that triangle up to the bluestone site there and draw a circle of that radius, one of the astonishments is that you almost define the Celtic church in Wales and Cornwall in the Middle Ages, because you've got there St David's, the See of St David's on that radius. You've got the Black Monastery of Minachlog Ddu and the bluestone sites there. You've got Llantwit Major, which was the major college and teaching centre and monastery for St Ichtyd. You've got Dunster just across the water there, which was the massive monastery at Old Cleve, and there's a whole sort of stuff going on there about Arthur as well. You've got St Column Major, which was to be the capital of Cornwall, I believe. And then you've got Trewerdreath and Lostwithiel, which was, again, the big Norman trading centre in later Norman trading centre after the Celtic stuff had changed. And if we take the line, north-south line here, and extend it downwards, we end up with the massive monastery built by the Normans at Trewerdreath, and up there at St Dogmills, which is right on the estuary of the River Tyne near Cardigan. So the fact is, if I put that sort of big beige blob on the map, we almost can define the major centres for religion in the Celtic Church. And finally, if we actually start looking even deeper at continuity, we have to ask why the hell is the 3 capital cities of Britain aligned on a 5, 12, 13 triangle? Because at that point, the subject starts to take on a heavy tone, more to do with psychology, and maybe possibly even who knows what about what these triangles do to people. But the fact is, which is astonishing, is that the new Scottish Parliament is built exactly on the measured apex of that, right near Arthur's Seat, right under Arthur's Seat. This was very nearly on, it's almost the classic symbol of London. What is the classic symbol of London? I mean, when you go to London in the aeroplane, what's the classic symbol that you notice? Or if you fly over it in an airplane? Anybody? Pardon? Parliament? The Dome? Tower of London? Okay. The Thames. It's the silver water, the snake of the Isis, the old name, flowing through the centre of London. And what's on the banks of the Thames that marks the end of that are two power stations. The one is a very famous logo of London, the Battersea one. All the fuss about whether the chimneys can be replaced by fiberglass or not, or whether they can be removed. And that's where this end, and the Chelsea power station, the one near the Chelsea Gardens there that powers the tube station and the emergency services. Not supposed to say that. Cardiff has a castle mound built by the Earl of Bute, who incidentally was a Scottish Freemason, blah, blah, blah. There's all sorts of stuff that's very, very much fun to explore, to do. And you go to bed at night and ask yourself, why has that happened? Why are all the capital cities in the southeast of the country arranged like that? So we've got connectivity, continuity, and this is all evidence that I'm producing. And I'm just one person. I mean, tomorrow you're going to get a feast from Howard Crowhurst and also from Mark Pawson, I guess. There's other world components which I don't want to cover today, but you can't help noticing them when you're wandering around sites and this sort of thing suddenly starts to happen on one photograph and a second later there's no sign of any of this. This sort of prevents the photo being useful in most contexts, but there's some nice white things wanging around at midsummer sunset. I'd love someone to tell me how to talk to those. I can't quite get it right yet. And then there's a sort of light under Pentreve. I'm watching me very carefully survey Lecadribeth, having just had my hair cut very short. And finally, there's a wonderful picture taken by a group member. We could actually see that light coming down from, you can see it skimming down from the sky, a red sort of rainbow-coloured light coming down. I'm not sure what that is, but everybody noticed it, and it felt very funny when it was going on. I don't know what these things are, but there are other things about this subject that we have got to start looking at, because the reason you're here today is that a lot of you are involved with studying these other phenomena. Now, no megalithists were harmed in the production of my work, and that actually is, although it's one of my pathetic jokes, it is actually an important comment here. Archaeology is essentially invasive. You dig a trench, you've done it irreparable. Stonehenge is like a potato field in the middle, whereas if you do this work, and you can do it just with GPSs if you want and maps and that, you don't harm the monuments in any way whatsoever. It's non-invasive. It's also very much less expensive than a dig. I mean, I'm managing to do it as a one person doing it, and I don't have to spend a huge budget to do it. There we are. We'll leave it at that. Now, I've been told, when do I actually finish, Hugh? Is it? It's quite a bit, isn't it? Well, that's what you asked me to do that. The verve for choreography is superb, isn't it? And this, don't you think? Hasn't it been a super day? God, those stories. Woo. Right. Well, I'm going to field some questions, because I feel like I need to do that. Would anyone like to ask any questions?
2 or 3 slides back, there was a word that I didn't recognise. Barclodiad.
Barclodiad. Yeah. It's a Welsh word. I live in Wales, and the problem we have is that, well...
What does it mean?
It means the apron of the goddess.
Thank you.
Apron of the goddess. It's actually Barclodiad de Gavres. Okay, that was an easy question. No, the answer to your question is, it is, but I hate Devon, so I've left it off. No, I wanted to look at the Celtic Church, and I'm writing a book with Paul Broadhurst at the moment, or I'm helping him with the book in some detail, and it's about Cornwall and Wales and the connections between them to do with the Arthurians' legend.
On the Cornish border, Tavistock,
Yeah.
and the abbey there is on your
Yes,
curve.
it is. There's also the Crediton Triangle, which if you go on a website, there's an incredibly funny website about people's cats going missing in the Crediton Triangle, which I enjoyed enormously. Sometimes on the web you hit gold, and there are some real witty people out there. Yeah.
Have you got a view on the only expectation is that they took all the stones that were piled up and kept all
Yeah.
on,
Well,
I wonder whether they were ever there.
Okay. Well, here's I hope you'll take this the right way. Have you been there? Well, can you possibly say the stones have gone? They're in the hedgerows of all the fields around the site. Yeah. Absolutely. I took Howard Crowhurst there this week, and one of the first things he said is, look, all this litter everywhere. For each of the... this is my home patch, and therefore it is vitally important that you recognise that because a farmer's got some Suffolk punches and he's pulled a few 4-ton stones to the edge, doesn't mean that the site, that a hedge isn't necessarily, especially in Pembrokeshire, isn't necessarily built by the council. It may be much older than that and contain huge megaliths, as at Parkameru near Fishguard.
So all the stone rows around the other parts of Wales are the remains of old mounds.
I don't say that either. I'm just saying that...
That's the way it sounds.
Well, I don't think I'm putting it that way. What I'm saying is that if you visit the sites, often there is evidence of farmers using stone for other purposes. Gateposts where I live are all bluestones and they've all got gudgeon pinholes, and some of them you can see the lead still in the hole. To get back to your point, we're dealing with a landscape that is largely ruinous. And the stones at Pentrefan that made the corbel top for which they think protected whatever was in the monument from damp, as you get at Newgrange, the flat stones, quite a few of them are on the path as you walk to Pentrefan. There are some wafer thin stones, they might weigh 2 tons, but they are incredibly thin stones, actually in the hedge as you walk to Pentrefan. And the other thing is that if you look at there is a picture on the little blurb board that you get at monuments. There's a picture of George Owen's 1603 engraving of Pentrefan showing a lot more stones around it's gone now, but around the famous logo, and they've all gone since 1603. So the answer to that is, where are they? Well, a Pembrokeshire hedge is traditionally 6 foot high, and at Parkameru you've got a 40-ton bluestone set in the wall near that alignment. One of the stones has been put and is now part of a 6 foot high wall. And so I'm not being flippant about your question. It's a very important one. Leca Dribeth, the farmer has just ploughed the field this year. Glyn has just ploughed his field, and he's left, because I said I would like to see them rather than he take them off. The big stones he ploughs up, he leaves just near the monument. You've seen them there? Yeah. And were you thrilled by them? Yeah, some of them are bluestone, as you probably noticed. They've got digger marks on. So we are trying, as Tom said, the important thing is whenever a site is altered or destroyed or a stone removed, it's important to clock where it is and, if necessary, leave some sort of mark in the ground. But the wholesale destruction of sites, of course, has been far worse as you come into England and go eastward than it is in the west, where you can't often drive a tractor and where there is a very low population density. The problem is profound in Brittany, where at Carnac, of course, whole villages have used dolmens as garages and sheds and built the side of the house against them and used the stone for building. And of course that happened in the Reformation as only 500 years ago. Thank you.
Robin.
Yeah. Nick.
Do you think these people were able to accomplish this, or how do you think they did it without notation? And if there was notation, what evidence is there of it?
It may be that the mixture of astronomy and geometry and metrology was to them a form of symbolic language, rather like we would say astrology is today, such that, if you had a midsummer sunset alignment and it was so many megalithic yards passage, or the angle was whatever it is, that in fact this was like saying you've got your moon in Virgo and your Saturn in which to an astrologer has a great meaning and yet means nothing to people who are not astrologers. In other words, I think Ewan Mackay, who wrote about chieftains and astronomer priests, and along with Colin Renfrew in the 70s, clearly saw that the monuments themselves are records. The notation implies something a bit more like writing, doesn't it? And we find cup and ring marks, and we find various other things, symbols, particularly in Brittany, where, of course, you've got Gavrinis and all those marked stones. I think the answer to your question is, from my own work, I would say that these monuments tell me a lot more in terms of meaning, which is, in fact, what communication is supposed to be about, than a lot of people talking to me does. I mean, getting a lot of meaning from, and that, if you like, may have been the notation. I don't know whether that makes any sense to anybody, but it sure makes sense to me. You go on a site and you soon get to know what. It's a bit like you go to the Yellow Pages, and unless you're looking for a swimming pool repairer, you don't go right through the whole. It doesn't have any meaning. But if it happens to fall open at swimming pool repair and you've got a 6-foot crack in your swimming pool, that has an enormous amount of meaning for you. Well, I'm an archaeoastronomer, and I find an enormous amount of meaning in the geometry, the astronomy, and the location of sites, an increasing amount, such that I am very, very excited about some of the information. I mean, most of this is new stuff. And it's not in the books of the 50s and 60s and 70s. It's new material. And new evidence is the worst nightmare for people who want to hold the subject back. And Nick, you know that. This stuff must be the stuff they dream about when when they go to bed on a bad day. Because it's only going to take discovery of a few more of these, and which is happening as I speak between myself and Howard. And we have got so many sites doing the same thing from south of France right up to north of Scotland, that the end product, the website things or the papers or the books, whatever it is, which are another form of notation, will then present a powerful force for a laxative. I've got there in the end. Anybody else? Edmund?
Probably one useful thing seems to be that all the pyramids on the planet are perfectly aligned, north, east, south, and west. Your right-angled triangle, do they go to true north?
Of course. Next question.
Robin, is anybody finally going to do something definitive on the...
Excuse me, I'll get my eardrum. Would you like to say that again?
Is somebody eventually going to do something definitive on the 1,500 before Plato Platonic solids that you were showing today, that Critchlow has so well brought up in the 70s? It's just that nobody's doing anything. They sit there.
They're in a drawer, and most of them actually are in a drawer in a cellar. Ewan Mackay has retired, as you're obviously informed on this, which is very heartening in itself. But Ewan Mackay retired, went down gradually to 1 day a week in the Hunt area, and doesn't like the system there now and is left altogether. But in fact, the amount of material there, and one doesn't know what else is down there, but Keith Critchlow told me that there were at least 300 down there, and Graham Challifor, who took the photo, said he couldn't believe how many there were when they were going through them to find the good examples of the 5 Platonic solids.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a long time ago. I think the book Time Stands Still that had that photo in was written in 1979.
79, exactly.
And it's just been redone last year. So the thing is that if there are 300 of these, it still doesn't alter the fact that we already have the information that the 5 Platonic solids were being played with either as counters, toys, or learning aids, whatever they were. long before Plato, and therefore, like the Pythagorean triangles, a long time before Pythagoras. You ever get the impression that the history you've got is a load of bunk?
Yeah, absolutely.
As Henry Ford said. And therefore, you know, my task is to provide as clean a source of information as I can, both for people like yourself who are interested in the subject, and also to feed that information to the archaeology profession, because, you know, archaeologists are decent guys, they're fine.
Well, you need to rock their boat, basically, don't you?
Need to what?
Rock their boats.
Oh, I thought you said write a book, and I went cold. Well, you see, if that can be described as slightly aggressive. Rattle cages, rock boats is probably about as far as it could go. But, you know, things change very slowly, unless there's a revolution. And what the revolution might be is a revolution of thought. I'd prefer it to be that, where the evidence just mounts to the point where if the archaeologists can't accept it, then everyone else will just drive around them, rather like the bypass around Swindon.
And crop circles.
Which also doesn't have much point, yeah. I think you've got to accept the fact that the problem is in the I tried to show that in the teaching of archaeologists. They don't take archaeologists who've done any maths or don't understand geometry. I don't mean that these people are thick, it's just that they've got an emphasis in their entry requirements which doesn't include the very subjects that we're talking about. And because of that, they're completely not equipped to do what I've just done in an hour, a very enjoyable time with you this afternoon. For which I thank you. What I want to talk to you about this afternoon is a cure for constipation I'm dealing with. And the constipation is about the past. And the constipation is that the culture that we live in seems to have a bit of a problem sort of moving things and adapting to things. And I want to start off, as the title of my lecture reveals, by looking at a recent phenomenon that is very typical of what our culture thinks about the past. About a year ago in the paper, and I'm talking front page of some papers, and I'm talking the news, the national news, two archaeologists, that's Darville and Geoffrey Wainwright, made a claim which was part of the publicity for the fact that they were taking garden spades to Salisbury A&E department, that a whole set of things had come together such that they were able to make this a very important announcement about Stonehenge, that people were coming to Stonehenge to be healed, that it was in fact a healing centre. I don't think any of you would have problems with that, especially those who came on the tour last night. There is something very special about sacred sites. In fact, the more time one spends at them, the more healthy generally you'll feel. But what was really interesting was the backdrop of this story. The story claimed that a dead Swiss horseman who was wealthy had ridden while very ill, and his body had been found, and it turned out that from dentology records of his teeth that he was a Swiss man, and he had been not cured because he was dead by these stones. And what happened then was that Geoffrey Wainwright, who was the English Heritage Director for a while, appeared on various programmes on television saying that in fact what had happened is that him and Timothy Darville had been all over for 7 years, all over the Preseli Mountains, and they had found that the Preseli bluestones, of which this is an example, name remotely like Arthur in Latin or British. English Heritage sole function is to enhance visitor numbers, and at Tintagel to sell the Arthurian goodies in their shop. Their press conference, that's English Heritage press conference on this stone being discovered, was hot on commerce and decidedly weak on fact and scholarship, and simply cheapened one of Cornwall's greatest sites. What is relevant is to grasp firmly that this discovery has absolutely no Arthurian meaning whatsoever, and that E.H.'s chief archaeologist should be ashamed of himself. Wow. So there was trouble at mill with this, wasn't there? So we then have, after the story broke with the bluestones, going back to the bluestones, the most well-known local author in the area of bluestones is Dr. Brian John, who happens to have had in a past life a job as a doctor involved in geology. So he knows his stones, one would imagine. He also wrote to all the papers and appeared on all the television in Wales. Interestingly, I don't think he appeared anywhere else, saying that there was, in his folklore experience, he's a local expert on local folklore, that the bluestones' magical properties, i.e. they heal people, had no basis in fact. He couldn't find a single evidence other than sacred springs have healing properties, which our previous speaker more than covered, and which any of you who visit those will know that it's not singled out for this area of anywhere, and he could find no evidence connecting the bluestones with healing properties. So this was a media triumph for English heritage, and of course what it did do is it increased the profile of the monument we call Stonehenge, which is a lovely little milk cow for English heritage, and I'm very grateful it's open now. But it doesn't answer that final point there, the mysteries of Stonehenge being solved, because they haven't been. What has happened is that we've put like a blur of fuzziness between us and the monument. And what I would like to do next is to look at the questions that I have been asked by many media companies and other people who've interviewed me in the 20 years I've been doing this, to define what are the questions that people need to have answered about Stonehenge. So we look first at the questions that we ask about this monument in order to try and get rid of this fuzziness, and which were brought to Stonehenge. We don't need to discuss how they got there, but they arrived at Stonehenge and they were used in Stonehenge, that these in fact had healing properties. Now I want you to read you a quote from Geoffrey. What I am suggesting has nothing ludicrous about it. These stones are connected with certain secret religious rites, and they have various properties that are medicinally important. Whenever people felt ill, baths were prepared at the foot of the stones, and they would pour water over them and run this water into baths in which their sick were cured. What is more, they mixed the water with herbal concoctions. There is not a single stone at Stonehenge which does not have medicinal value. Did that sound rather like what you heard on telly? Yes. Well, it was actually, that is 873 years earlier. Another Geoffrey of Monmouth said that. So, woo. So, now, you might remember, if we go even further back, and I am starting to get a bit critical of these sorts of episodes because they block other things that are going on at monuments, that 10 years ago, you might remember, a stone was found with some script on it at Tintagel, the legendary conception and birthplace of King Arthur. Now this happened when Geoffrey, not of Monmouth, but Geoffrey Wainwright, was in fact the E.H. director at that time. And the local, or the archaeologist in charge of Cornwall, Britain's leading expert on Dark Age inscribed stones, wrote an article in this little Cornish magazine Main Manvro, which I may recommend to you. And in it he says about this stone that was discovered, which he was completely removed from any comment on. Wainwright went to the press with it, and of course it was, again, headline news, it was on all the media, and he said, "We do not need the gift of prophecy to foresee the sort of shameless hype by English Heritage, the commercial agency that administers this duchy-owned ancient monument, that happened soon afterwards. First, some facts. The word Artugnu is not the Latin for Arthur, as quoted. It is not even Latin, but late British, ancestor of Cornish. Among 300 or so inscribed stones from post-Roman Wales and Cornwall, none bears any, and start to put something together that makes more sense. I like sense. I presume that you've come to this lecture because you do too. No one said no. We'll move on. Who built it? Well, archaeology has done a brilliant job of telling us a little bit about the Wessex culture, and it's not done any job at all about telling us other things about the culture, but we have their dental records, we know how people died, we know the age at which they died, and that is the job of archaeologists. It's basically still to take things out of the earth and start to, through various very, very powerful scientific methods, such as radiocarbon dating, drilling into bones, finding out dental records, finding out what people died of, and it's a whole science. There's one very big expert at our local university called Ros, who really took me through the process. It's remarkable. It's like a police forensic. And in fact, indeed, some of her work is when a corpse is found, or a skeleton is found, to identify that it died well before the police would have any interest in it. So there's who built it has been answered to some extent. We know quite a lot, although it's only in my lifetime that we know quite a lot about when many of these monuments were built. This morning you heard how these boundaries have been pushed back and back and back and back. When I was a lad, which is, as you implies, quite a long time ago, Stonehenge was blessed with the research of Professor Richard Atkinson, an archaeologist of the old school, very high-profile archaeologist who wrote probably still one of the best books, single books on the subject of the monument, just called Stonehenge. Great title. Now, Atkinson had three phases of Stonehenge. Basically, it began around 2000 BC and finished at 1400. Now we've pushed that earlier date back at least 1,000 years, and the 1400 remains more or less when things were abandoned at Stonehenge. So archaeology has done quite a good job, and radiocarbon dating was an amazing explosion for people who were involved in archaeology, leading to Stuart Piggott saying that the scientist data, radiocarbon data, was archaeologically unacceptable. And there was a battle, and everyone had to revise their theories on Bronze Age and Neolithic life. Now, we don't need to go into that, but those two questions, who built it, when was it built, have been addressed fairly and squarely, and much progress has been made. Why was it built? We enter into a very, very different arena. And this lecture is about why that question hasn't been answered, really. Why Stonehenge was built is about more than just the monument itself. It's about the aspirations of the people, the culture or cultures that wanted to drag these enormous big sarsen stones 17 miles as the crow flies from Marlborough Downs, Fifield Down, and the bluestones, of which are the diminutive bluestones, but nevertheless up to 4.5 tons, 135 miles as the crow flies from West Wales. Now, even if we accept that they did that for some because they needed nice stone, there must, one feels, be some reason why you would want to carry stones that distance, and we must look at that. Now, the archaeologists haven't really addressed that, and in fact, my dearly departed friend John Michel, in his book of the name of this conference, says that the end product of all these labours of all these archaeologists hasn't answered the primary question of why there are so many of them and why they were built in the first place. I might be misquoting that a little, but it's more or less what he said. The next question is even more interesting because we need to know why was it built where it is. Because one assumes, and if you've been to Stonehenge, and especially if you've been where these ladies are, if you've been to Stonehenge, you can't imagine that this site was ever built without a plan. And we can't ever imagine how it, or why it was built where it is without somebody giving that some thought. Just as we have planners today, you wouldn't stick a stone circle in a position that wasn't, should we say, propitious for the area or the situation. And these sites, and all stone circles, are normally so beautifully attended to in terms of the fine detail of where they're situated, that actually it is possible to go to some sites and find yourself totally enchanted by the cleverness of the ability to find just the perfect spot. Now, Alexander Thom, of which you know I'm quite fond, or was quite fond of his work, even waxes more lyrical about that aspect of stone circles in his books than anything other, when he describes how engineers, because his word for the boys, was a Victorian. They didn't have the girls in Victorian time doing engineering.